Getting to what distinguishes blog from traditional publishing. There's a number of things. One, I mean, the most obvious thing is you get a wider audience. The internet has developed in the last 15 or 20 years. So I think that, things move faster in terms of being shared. Though, as we'll come back to it too, I think you also want to keep a place in mind that sometimes something doesn't jump right away in popularity in a moment. Like you may write something and you feel like no one's paying attention. And then literally like 2 or 3 years later, someone finds it and they love it and they post it on like a newsletter or a Facebook page and it explodes, right? So, I mean, keep in mind that I would say that your motivation for writing should be because you like to write and get these ideas out, not because you're necessarily expecting an immediate kind of gratification from it. And also remember, just because something isn't read widely doesn't mean it's not read by an audience who is deeply invested in the subject. And so even if you only hit 5 people, you may hit the most important 5 people in that discussion or in that kind of milieu, if you will. So it's a shorter format. And, if you ever watch, there's a documentary on New York Times obituaries, right? And this guy, at one point, he's having all these problems because people keep writing saying he's making mistakes. And the guy goes, look, he goes to one of his fellow obituary writers and says, I don't understand. I keep making this guy's like, write less. He's like, and the guy's like, yeah, write less is a good idea, but writing shorter is actually harder because you have to be more concise. You have to be more precise with your language, with your arguments, and even with the adjectives you use. So it's a shorter format, which at first might sound easier, but in some ways can actually be harder. Now, this is a big debate that goes on within blogging, the blogging sphere. Are we peer reviewed? I think we've come down on a side that says, no, we're not peer reviewed, but as Abigail points out correctly, we're reviewed by peers. And honestly, I'm not saying it's better or worse because they're kind of like apples and oranges, but I do think there's an advantage to doing it this way because in general, when you're writing for a public audience, most of them won't be as invested or have the background you have in a subject. And so you have to figure out how to convey these ideas. And really as a teacher, which many of you are, not everybody, obviously, like I don't do that anymore much. But the point is that if you are trying to convey an idea to a broad audience, you need to be able to understand how to reach them if they don't have the background you do. So I think, and considering the role of history and facts in today's society and culture, I do think it's actually a much more important role than there was in the past. So I'd say that those are the main things. The one other thing I'd say in terms of shorter format is I know for our blog, we publish anything from like 400 words to 3,000, but I think we always tend to say that the sweet spot tends to be between 1,000 and 1,500 words, just long enough that you can get into some depth, but short enough that you don't lose anybody's kind of attention. That's not to say you can't write a great longer piece that resonates widely. We just think that it tends to fall into those numbers most frequently. So I guess we'll move on to slide 4.
Yeah. So what makes a good history blog piece? Ryan touched on it already, but you really want to kind of stay focused. So picking really a single argument or claim is key, I think. That doesn't mean that you can't introduce complexity. It just really means you have to understand the limits of people's time and attention and really pick the one takeaway that is most important, that you really want them to understand. It's always helpful to have a hook to a contemporary issue or something that people are thinking about, though actually some of my favorite blog posts are evergreen, isn't the right word, but are not tied or pegged to a particular moment or trying to intervene into public debate. However, I think understanding your audience is always important and helping them to see the relevance to the world around them. That's as good a hook. So beautiful writing, what do we mean by beautiful writing? This is not Shakespeare. Not everything has to be elegiac and deeply descriptive. However, clarity, I think the most beautiful writing is clear, and writing that never creates a hiccup for the reader, where they can just go and it slides by and it's very fluid. Yeah, description and imagery and vivid storytelling is always really valuable, but most of all, you want a frictionless reading experience. And the last thing is evidence and citation. So we've sort of at the Metropole fallen on like taken the stance that citations are actually really valuable and people like them and use them or like refer to them. And that's not just our audience who are trained as or work as historians. Lots of people really value it. And we find it's also valuable to show people that citation matters. There's also the kind of the aspect of revealing that the scholarly pursuit is a collaborative one, even if we're a single authorship discipline, that we're always in conversation with each other. And so it's a way of both demonstrating that collegiality and also giving props and dues to people who you're working, whose work you're drawing from. So not every blog uses citations, but my advice always is to write as if you were going to have a citation. You always want to use, sorry, let me say that differently. Not write as if you're going to have a footnote, but to write in a way that shows your sources. I think that's probably a more useful piece of advice, because sometimes you will have to use hyperlinks or you just won't have the ability to put a footnote or citation in. So doing kind of, in-text indications of where you're drawing your information from is really valuable. And I think readers outside of the academy really value that insight into who is doing the work. Okay, next. Sorry, one sec.
Yeah, and let me just add to what Abigail said, two points. One, the whole, I think the citations is good because like we all did math, and remember when you used to get as much credit for showing your math as for the actual result. And I think in a way that this is actually helpful for you, because particularly some of you guys are younger scholars, some of you are older. I'm in my mid 40s. I forget stuff I've written. And I forget how I got there. And the citations, when I go back, are actually like a roadmap to my thought into like what I was looking for. And sometimes can be a basis for me to write a different piece or go back and find other information that I had forgotten. Particularly if you write a lot. And I think when you teach a lot, with like everyone here probably will be, and writing a lot, it's just a way to get back to where you were. And then to the beautiful writing point, and this is something we've in our fiction, fiction in the city that we featured. And I think I'm forgetting, Kevin Cruz has tweeted about this, as of others. Read a lot of fiction. That is one of the best ways to become a good writer. Just, think about how a fiction writer captures your imagination in a moment, in a scene. And to Abigail's point about language, I think one of the best books that I've ever taught or read was The Stranger by Camus. It's like 110 pages, and he doesn't use a single big word in that book. And yet he gets at all these really complex ideas when you really sit down and think about it. So I just, always look for, I think a good writer reads widely, whatever discipline they're writing in. So that's just to say about that. Now, I think, Abby, you want me to do this one, or do you want to do this one?
I'll go over it really quickly, but I just want to add to the point you just made about reading widely. I've also, I feel really fortunate that I had some really good writing instructors in graduate school. But even so, they were really influential on me in writing clearly, but not in doing storytelling and scene work. And I'm going to drop in the chat the link to creativenonfiction.org. Creative Nonfiction is a foundation that does writing workshops, and I've had the opportunity to do workshops on on scene and playing with time and other kind of techniques that creative writing uses that can be applied to nonfiction. And so, yeah, definitely there are some great resources out there for how to work on that part of the craft. Okay, so this is kind of the overview of, we're going to go into more detail in coming slides, but the basics of writing a compelling history blog post. So concise thesis, pick a good anecdote or story, make sure you're doing a thoughtful job of scaffolding your context in among your story and thesis, give evidence, but not too much, close the loop, and always put the reader first. And again, this is pretty basic writing advice, not that can be applied to any historical writing, but we're going to try to show examples from the medium of blogging, and kind of hone in on examples so that you can see how it works in this shorter format. So RR, why don't you talk about theses?
Yeah, so I mean, you guys have all written thesis, and actually there are a couple of you in the audience. I was just curious to your thoughts about this as we move forward, and so I'll ask in a second. Obviously, I think we were talking about this before, so I'm a big Joan Didion person, obviously, and she famous, to paraphrase her, she said once, basically, I don't know what I think about something until I write it or write about it. I would say that that's true for me. There are times I have a thesis going into something, I'll go with it, but then by the time I'm done with it, that thesis I came up with in the intro maybe wasn't totally what I was actually, when I went through all the evidence and I did, that's not exactly what I meant. So I have to go back. So I think the larger point is we understand that maybe your thesis isn't rock solid at first. It should be rock solid when you're done, right? But the point is to have a point that you're trying to make, even if that point isn't as precise when you start, you hope that by the end it will be precise. But you do want to think about what point do you want the reader to come away with? Think about, and you've probably heard this in your grad seminars and elsewhere, have your cocktail party pitch or your elevator pitch, when you have to explain, hey, this is what I want to write about, and this is why it matters. You will tire endlessly of hearing the phrase, what are the stakes? But here's the thing, that actually does matter. You have to, because remember, when you're writing this stuff, there's so much stuff online, there's so much stuff people read, you have to give them a reason as to why they should read your piece. And I know I said before, you shouldn't care, and that's true, but you should be able to tell yourself why you think it's important. So think of it that way. If you don't want to think of it as reaching out to an audience, because maybe that's inauthentic or whatever, but just do it for yourself in the end. There are multiple ways to write this thesis, direct, woven, the narrative. We're going to go through some of these. I'll be very frank. Some I'm less a fan of than others. And, we can talk about this. This is one example, for example, the direct example. I'm just going to read quickly. This post explores the contrast between the two approaches that outlines the intervention that Black students made in the IVCF to reshape collegiate ministry in light of America's endemic racial order. Taken together, their disruption and sustained intervention illustrate a dynamic Black evangelical faith taking shape in the late 1960s that fused the language of Black cultural identity with evangelical mission strategy to work for racial equality, a development worthy of its own name, the Black evangelical Renaissance. Now, I think everything about this approach is solid, except I personally hate the thing this post explores or this article will discuss. That being said, it is direct, it is clear, it is precise. It's kind of like, you go see a movie that's very innovative, like I'm Not There by Todd Haynes about Bob Dylan. It was this crazy movie about Bob Dylan that I actually had to see a couple times to understand. I was, oh, this is innovative, this structure. And it was really good in part because of the structure innovation. But there's also movies that are good that take a straightforward idea that you've seen a million times, but they do it so well, it's still great, right? This is kind of like that movie. We will always, at least I will always try to get you to change this approach if you send it. But if you really like it and you do it well, we will not make you change it. So I guess this is kind of like the tried and true method of I'm going to do this thing. Here's this thing. And then you explain it. And it does work. It's not as creative or innovative, but again, if you do this very well and you do it in a way that's very clear and precise, it can work. Now, I'm just curious, does anyone else in the audience, or Abigail or Stephanie or Professor Strauss, anyone, do you have thoughts on that particular approach?
I tend to be a direct thesis writer. I mean, but though usually I write the whole thing and then come up with a thesis at the end. Like I don't necessarily even try. I write my introductions at the end and then put them in the front. So what you were talking about, how, got to figure out what you're writing through doing it.
Yeah, no, everyone's going to be different. I just, we wanted to go over the direct approach because it is like a very fundamental way to get started. And for some people, it's just the best way. And if you do it well, it can work very, very well. I also wanted to convey that I have reservations about the approach sometimes also. But
I'd also
say in the comments, we'll go on the next one. Go ahead, Stephanie.
I'd also say is in editing, that's often what I'm looking for when I'm editing these pieces, because a lot of them come through and it's not clear what the thesis is. At least
yes, that is. Yeah, that's the. Go ahead.
I would agree. I actually, in trying to come up with examples to share with y'all, like it was not always easy to find examples of thesis statements. I stepped back and I spent some time wondering, like maybe we're putting too much emphasis on it. Maybe it isn't an important part of an effective blog post. But when I reflected a bit more, I realized that the only posts I remembered of the like 25 that I had read were the ones with thesis statements. So I think it's an important hook to rest your hat on. I'm terrible with these expressions, but I think when you can sum it up in a sentence, your reader is very well served by that. I also don't mind the direct approach, but I agree, Ryan, if I were the editor of this piece, I would have revised this sentence too. The interventions that Black students made in IVCF to reshape collegiate ministry in light of America's endemic racial order reveal that the contrasting approaches, and taken together, their disruption, blah, 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 blah. So you didn't need this post explores then outlines.
Totally agree.
So, and that's what a good editor can help with. Let's look at the woven example. So no pressure to read this. I have on the next slide a condensed version, but I just wanted you to see the bold is what I think the thesis is, and the unbolded is the storytelling around it. So Nicole Nelson wrote this post about Shaker Heights for us 3.5 years ago, 4 years. I mean, it's one of our earlier posts from our Cleveland Metro of the Month, and it is by far and away one of our most read posts. It's been picked up in other publications. It was in 538. Was it in the Atlantic too? Or another? It was another
reference by 538, and then maybe in the Atlantic as well. Yeah. Yeah.
It's gotten some big. What are they in blogging? They call pingbacks or whatever.
Claire Malone referenced it. Yeah.
Yeah.
When she was working for.
Right. So. What I like about the piece is it really takes you from the start to the end of the story of how the suburb of Shaker Heights outside Cleveland recognized white flight was a problem and tried some experiments to integrate the neighborhood and stabilize home values and the character of the neighborhood. But Nicole doesn't actually do one condensed thesis block. She actually weaves it into the storytelling. So I think if you look at this condensed example, you can see this is really her thesis. Spurred by the firebombing of Pegg's Garage on January 3rd, 1956, white residents as well as African-American newcomers formed the Ludlow Community Association in 1957. The first president was most concerned with stopping the rumors that Ludlow was going to turn into a ghetto due to the influx of Black residents and ensuing white flight. And so as a result, Barnett sought out strategies to encourage whites to purchase homes in the community. But the focus on white homeowners to maintain integration meant discouraging Black people from purchasing homes. So although it was never like encouraging discrimination, its actions had that effect. Is basically what her thesis is. And what I like about this approach is her narrative never slows down. You're never kind of pulled out from the storytelling, and yet you still are given a really clear summation of what the problem was, what the attempt to fix it was, and why it failed, and what the stakes were. So I think when done thoughtfully, you don't have to necessarily have a single sentence thesis. And as long as you are clear when you are arguing, it can kind of go anywhere in the piece. It doesn't have to be at the very, very beginning, and it doesn't have to be condensed into one paragraph. Okay, anecdotes and narratives. So I'm a huge fan of the anecdote approach. Let me clarify that I'm differentiating between anecdotes and narratives, because I think there are different approaches to doing a blog post. You can have multiple anecdotes, meaning different scenes and stories and characters that have a shared theme. Or you can go like Nicole did and take one narrative and be like, this is one neighborhood over the course of just one decade, and I'm going to take you through the major, plot points. Other times that there is no clear, tight story like that, right? You're looking at different moments, different people, different approaches. So I kind of, my framework for an anecdote-based blog post is that you always have a primary, a secondary, and possibly a tertiary. So you kind of start with this vivid scene or character, something that really sucks in the reader and gives them a sense of the stakes. The secondary anecdote is usually supportive. It's reinforcing the points made in the first, and it doesn't have to be as vivid. It doesn't have to have the same kind of like compelling characters. And the tertiary is the one that kind of helps you introduce some complexity. So it's similar, but a little bit different, or it's oppositional. And you're saying, we have these two examples, but also this other thing kind of happened that makes it a little less clear. And I think that approach can work really well in addition to the more straightforward narrative approach. We've seen great examples of both in editing for the Metropole. This first example, I would actually say, Ryan, I'll talk about it a little more, but I would say this is, when I think of anecdote, this is always, always, always the first one I think of. I remember the first time I read this, I swooned. I just thought it was like so evocative.
And I think that's the key. The nail file was a gift. Whether it belonged to Mary, Margaret, Estelle, Carmen, or Jean, we will never know. What we do know, however, is that one of these 14, 15-year-old girls acquired the file while on trial for juvenile delinquency at the Manhattan Children's Court in 1944. I think what's great about that is it gives you of this image of this very like mundane item, right? This nail file, but we've all seen one. Maybe we've all used one. And then the great thing about this is there's a lot of uncertainty in this opening, right? All we know is that there's a nail file. We don't know who it belonged to. It may have belonged to any one of these girls, but the fact that there are 5 girls and they all appeared in juvenile court for delinquency, and this nail file, this mundane thing, is connected to this thing that maybe we're not so used to thinking about. So you have this very mundane object and this very odd object, and you're putting them together in the same sentence. And I think the juxtaposition of those two things to what Abigail was pointing out is a very effective way to kind of make the reader kind of think without them even knowing it. And I think that this was actually, I think this took 2nd place in our first annual grad blog contest, if I remember correctly.
I think it was the 2nd year. Yeah.
The 2nd year. Okay.
But yeah,
everything collapses when you hit a certain age, but, but I know that it did well. It's actually one of our more popular pieces. I think it got picked up again to our point about from a newsletter, and then it really kind of expanded. I think some of this, some of the way you approach the writing, and I don't want to spend too much time on this example because we kind of explained why we think it's so great already. But it's also got to do with the kind of questions you're asking. So, for example, in sports, a lot of times reporters will ask, and you see this in politics too, tell me about blank to a politician or a player. Those are actually terrible questions because they're so just broad. And I think a lot of internet writing is kind of like an answer to that question. Tell me about blank. And I think what we're trying to get you to do is like, don't tell me about blank, tell me about this specific thing. Don't just give me your like expansive thoughts. So that's why I think that this example is particularly good, because it's very specific in its opening, and yet there's uncertainty and certainty at the same time. So it mixes all these kind of things at once.
So funny you bring up that example of sports reporters, because every time my husband sees it, he like screams about it. And so I've become really attuned to how prevalent that line of questioning is.
I think it's reflective of the larger writing on the internet for some folks, though. So I do think like you want to avoid that trap if you can.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, you also edited this one, Ryan.
Right.
I'll just say, I find this kind of like maybe elegiac is an overstatement, but I think it's really beautiful writing.
Yeah, this by Mirna Santiago, who writes obviously about Central America, and this was for our disaster month. Basically, resilient city, the resilient city. We didn't want to focus on disaster. We want to focus on the ability of cities to recover. We felt that just focusing on the disaster angle was kind of like sensationalistic. So we felt like, well, hey, how can we, from cities across the world, discuss how they bounce back? And, I think in this one, I think has the advantage, and this is something when people are writing about places that aren't in the US or aren't in North America, but particularly English-speaking North America, I think there is something to kind of mixing in the native language or the language that is predominant there, and using the interpretations and explaining them in the language that you're writing in to the audience, because it does establish, we do think about things differently according to the language we speak, because languages do structure how we talk and how we conceive of things, also connotation, things like that. And I think what she does great here is she mixes, these terms, unhappy, I'm not going to try to say the Spanish terms, sufrida, suffering, and she notes the gendered aspect of these things, which is something that is obviously pertains specifically to this language as well, because Spanish and French are kind of more gendered language than English, and she's conveying that into this essay as well. This did quite well, and we also liked it because we kind of feel that Central America gets short shrift sometimes, particularly for urbanists. And so we were happy that she could both use this kind of vivid example, draw upon the language itself, which brings in a cultural aspect also, and then also kind of use the language's own structures to kind of help bring out this story in the beginning.
Yeah, I think it really sucks you right in and for, makes you think like, oh, do I know anything about Managua? Like now I had no idea about these earthquakes. I want to learn more. And, so scaffolding, this is, I don't want to spend a ton of time on this. We're all pretty familiar with the need to kind of toggle between storytelling, basic contextual information, and argumentation. But I do want to show some examples that I think reveal how that short blogging format can make the balance a little challenging, but also that there are some strategies that you can use to do it well. So this is the context first. So in this blog post, Ryan, did you solicited this one and edited it? Do you want to talk about this one?
Yeah. And she's she's actually not a historian. She's more like an architectural critic. But when we did a month on Accra, we've really tried to focus on cities outside the US and North America as well. Particularly, we've done actually we've done Lagos and Accra in particular. And so when we do cities, particularly outside the US, it's not that we're not open to doing this with the US too, but we definitely try to be as broad as possible because to be honest, I just have less of a foothold on the history of those places. And so we sought her out because we thought she could give us kind of this visual idea of the city and its architecture. And so what we liked about this intro is that the context comes first, right? As Abigail was saying, there's not a hook necessarily in the beginning of this piece. Instead, it's kind of giving you this very quick thumbnail layout of the architecture, and then goes on to this, again, she does the direct approach, right? So you see she's mixing the context first, but then in the second paragraph says, look, this article argues that there is no crisis of identity in the city, but rather there are multiple styles of architecture that represent the varied tastes and lifestyles in the city. It names one of these styles, despite architecture, which we thought was awesome. And because that was this term that she used to kind of place the Accra architecture under this umbrella. This despite architecture being this argument that it's architecture, it's important despite the fact it's so kind of variant in the city. And particularly in Africa, they do have this kind of tropical modernism thing that happened after the 50s, which is really this interesting mix of the environment and modernism from earlier decades. And this happens to occur in Accra as well. And I think what's good here about the direct approach is that it comes, and even though I'm not crazy, obviously I've already said I'm not crazy about it, it comes after the context. And so again, though, I think to Abigail's point with the early one, I think she could have probably written this without saying this article argues so much as she could have just said, there is no crisis of identity in the city. So I guess sometimes I feel like it's a crutch the writer depends on to make themselves feel better. But if it makes you feel better and you still do it well, then just do it. And I think she does a good job of juxtaposing those two kind of approaches in one.
Yeah. And just, I didn't put a color key, but red is the context. The bold black or gray is the thesis. And we'll see in this example, Anecdote is in blue. So this is a relatively recent post about SB 8, the Texas abortion law. And I really found the anecdote moving, I guess. I thought about Dr. Curtis Boyd when I heard that the Supreme Court greenlit Texas's unprecedented abortionist restrictions. And it just kind of pulls you in right away. But after Frank introduces you to Dr. Boyd, he has to step back and say, okay, I can't assume you know what SB 8 is. This is what SB 8 is and why Dr. Boyd's story in particular is really resonant in light of its passage, because his career has spanned pre-Roe through Roe, and now in this, not post-Roe, but Roe ? Period. And so by the time you get to the thesis, Boyd's history reminds all of us that coercive laws don't stop abortion. Rather, such laws change the cost, meaning, and conditions under which abortions are provided. The reader has the information they need to understand that the important part of Boyd's story is that he was there before. row and will continue to be there after SB 8. And this third example, I have to thank Amanda Seligman, our stalwart colleague, for bringing this blog post to my attention. It's a fascinating piece from Perspectives on History by Amy Stanley, where she uses this story from, when was it? Yeah, 19th century Japan, which she has written about in her research. And she plays with time. So she starts us back in the 19th century. Tsuneno changed her story when she arrived in the capital city of Edo in the 10th month of 1839, blah, 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 blah. And then her context actually, and her thesis come much later. She bounces from the 19th century to 2010, when she was first researching and writing about the story. And then she goes back to telling Tsunenu's story. And then she goes I guess, was it 2015, 2016, when the Me Too movement really erupts. And she is always foregrounding Tsunenu and her experience of describing her sexual assault, while also giving the context of how she approached it as a historian, what the work of the historian is, and how that changed once she was encouraged by the Me Too, Stanley was encouraged by the Me Too movement to listen to Tsunenu's changing story through the lens of a victim, or not a victim, I should say, a survivor, and not to look at it as a historian looks at an unreliable narrator. So really encourage people to look at that. But I think what's interesting about it is it really doesn't do a very direct approach. It kind of staggers context, it staggers argument in between this really, within this really powerful anecdote. All right, Ryan, I'll let you talk about evidence.
Yeah, so, one thing, anecdotes, your narrative, they have to support your thesis, but so there's a couple things here. You have to have faith in that what you're writing is clear on the one hand, but that the examples you're giving do connect on some level. I think a lot of times it only takes like a sentence, like a topic sentence here and there to connect a lot of these things. And they seem much more complicated when you're writing it. But when it comes to like stringing them together, the evidence can be harnessed in a way in much simpler. Like a lot of times we hand back edits. I think when you first see the comments, I think people like take a step back, like, oh, that's a lot. But actually, most of the edits, I have to say, really only require a sentence or two for you to just say, hey, we need you to like signpost this thing that you have in the paragraph. And it's like one sentence will do that for you. But I think when you look at the edit, sometimes you think, oh, I have to write a whole other paragraph. But no, you just need this one thing that kind of takes the reader from point A to point B, because right now you're taking the reader from A to C, and this B thing is missing. But the B thing is important, but you don't need to like dig a deep hole to get to it, right? I always found that, and I drew this from a bad Gus Van Sant movie, as I was telling Abigail, sometimes when you get started, the easiest way to get started is to use a quote from something and then build on that quote to explain how it relates to your thing. And that's another way of kind of connecting your evidence, is to think about a piece of it and then write something that connects that piece of it to the larger body that you're discussing. What context would you need to provide to help the reader to understand that moment, that past, the contingency, that why? What's the thing that connects those three? Are there examples that would reinforce your point or add nuance? Because, on the one hand, you can give very obvious examples that kind of, when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. On the other hand, you can give examples that say, well, yes, this is true. The nail thing is true. But if you look at it, like, for example, I was recently working on something on the Supreme Court and the National Environmental Protection Act. The court has heard 17 cases over its history on the NEPA, right? And all 17 environmental interest lost. So they're 0-17 over 40 years. But if you read this article by this environmental historian, he's like, yes, but then the state often made all kinds of concessions for each of those losses, such that there actually were environmental gains in those cases. But once it got to court, they were mooted and they lost the case. But actually, this other thing held up. So the example there you could say, well, 0-17, it's been terrible, and that's probably true. But it's actually, if you give like a sentence or two, just saying like, yeah, but the Solicitor General had to agree to this or that, which then kind of was a compromise, then you've both illustrated your main point, that the court is basically very hostile to NEPA, but at the same time said, but at the same time, there's this nuance to it that you should understand that kind of doesn't make it perfect, but doesn't make it as bad as you want. Now, the last thing, avoid block quotes. Avoid block quotes, avoid block quotes, avoid block quotes. Even if the block quote is obvious and direct, as you learn, as you get older in life, being right is not enough. You kind of have to, like, the best thing to do, and I know a lot of you already know this, but just to reiterate, the best thing to do is to only quote like the most important sentence or phrase of the block quote. Paraphrase the rest of it. It'll make you a better writer anyways, and it'll give you a better grasp of the argument because you've been forced to reinterpret it in another way that better explains it.
Yeah, I would say one of my, when I'm editing, I often notice that I've skipped the block quotes and I have to go back and read them once I've read the whole piece. I think it's just very easy to slide past, and people just often don't read them. So why include
people
them?
Never read them.
Yeah, to your point about being, what is it, it's not always enough to be right. I would also say, so you talked about, Ryan, about having to do a little more unpacking of evidence, but I would say just as often we send back pieces and we're just like, this is too much evidence. To use your example about these court cases, like, we don't need to hear about all 17. Pick one. One is enough, and tell us how that one helps us understand the other 16.
Yeah, how it's indicative. Exactly.
Yeah, but I will not read about all 17. Okay. Closing the loop. I actually feel pretty strongly about this point. So I actually I think we very rarely see people ever restate their thesis at the end of blog posts. And I think that's fine. Actually, I think that's good. If you've written a compelling blog post, people remember by the end what your thesis is or what argument you're trying to make. And they've seen through how you've talked about the topic why it's important. And you don't need to tell them again why it's important, but they do get to the end and want to know why you as the author care about the topic, or what the author's personal stakes are, or they're looking for a call to action. What can I do about this? But most often, I think, as historians, the approach that works for us in historical blogging is to reveal the path forward. So this is how you can continue to explore this topic, or these are the research questions that are opened up. I would say that is probably the most common thing we see is, okay, now that we understand, like, I'm thinking of a recent post we had about historic preservation and landlords that wasn't part of our grad student blogging contest. Like, now that we understand the way that historic preservation fed into conservative politics and like the neoliberal turn, what do we need to look at next? Like, what do we need to understand about the historic preservation movement today, and what their responsibilities are in terms of restorative justice? And I thought actually that was, Brian did a really good job at the end of saying like, we, the movement needs to think about the repercussions and how they can kind of, make it right going forward. So yeah, sort of the cardinal rules. Always put the reader first. I think it's really easy, especially when we're so invested in our research topics, to say, no, this detail is so important. This detail matters. I have to add this extra claim because I need that complexity. You might, it's true, but like always step back and say, can the reader process this complexity in 1,200 words? The answer is often no. 1,200 words is not enough time to grapple with the complexity. At the same time, trust the reader. And that doesn't mean trust that the reader has the background, like the necessary context, but do trust that they can follow your logic, and that you don't always need to be really explicit in connecting A to B to C, that they'll follow along, and you don't have to lead them. You only need 1 or 2 breadcrumbs. And finally is, not to take yourself or the endeavor too seriously. Really, most people are reading this in their leisure time, and if you want them to read it, not that it has to be a pleasant topic or content, it can be challenging, but just kind of remembering that they're not getting a grade at the end, they're not in the classroom, like they're not feeding this back into their research process. So
take your subject seriously, just don't take yourself too seriously.
There you go. Thank you.
Basically what we're trying to say, because there are going to be people who say like mean things maybe, and you just have to kind of let it roll off your back. But that's also mean you're engaging them at the same time. Yeah. So sometimes negative responses to a piece are actually positive, because it means that you're making people think. And to Abigail's point, you're not going to solve the world in 1,200 words. Yeah. Right. However, you can lead people to ask questions that are productive in those 1,200 words, and make them think about this subject that you've obviously spent a lot of time thinking about, and try to get them to kind of come to not a conclusion necessarily, but to very least say, well, yeah, why is it like that? And why have we proceeded in this way? And maybe there are better ways. So I guess it depends on ultimately the questions you're asking as to the expansiveness of the argument and the post. Yeah. All right, so we've reached the workshop-y part of our time today. So thanks for holding up through that very front-loaded information dump. We're going to do a breakout exercise. So we're going to start. Everyone's going to have 5 minutes to think of the seed of a blog post. So I want to show an example of probably my favorite seed that came to fruition as a blog post. So when I was writing my dissertation, I was writing about a Jewish community center in Manhattan, and one of the board members just really always fascinated me because he wrote these pretty terrible poems, and I just thought it was quirky. And I just wanted to write a blog post about it. And as I kind of really delved back into his bio and how he had kind of made an influence on this Jewish community center, I really realized that his was a story about kind of the limits of post-war liberalism, that he really pushed the organization, the agency to embrace
its very diverse neighborhood around it, and to be as accepting and open of a community center as possible, while also in no way being an anti-racist, so this kind of tension. And so I kind of use this poetry as a starting point to unpack his, not his, and by virtue, like a lot of post-war liberals' worldview. But I still managed to kind of get to this poetry in at the end. Let not the disappointment of yesterday frustrate your hopes for tomorrow. Let not regret of the failures in days gone by weaken your will for success in the days to come. Let not past defeat bar future victory. While time has no beginning and no ending, every day is a new day in the life of man, a day of renewed hope and courage, keeping alive a lifelong faith of man in himself. I mean, it's sentimental. But so think of things like that. We all have these bits from the archive that we keep coming back to, that make us curious about the person or topic. And think about, like, what historical point can that anecdote help you make? Like, what does the poem show us about, well, certainly not post-war poetry, but about the world in which it was written? What context do you need to provide? So in my example, like, I had to go dig into Lewis's bio, and he was a judge, and how do I put his judicial experience in relation to the work he did as a board member of this agency? Then, what other anecdotes or pieces of evidence should go along with it? So are you going to do the one big narrative approach, or like I do in the Judge Lewis post, it's a series of different anecdotes? His bio, his this one time at the Jewish Community Center when he really opposed what he felt like was discriminatory policy. Then what's your conclusion, your call to action, your connection to the present? So with that poem, I was kind of hearkening to, it was under the last presidential administration, and I was saying, we're at another time where we can think about perhaps our own limits of our liberalism, and what we can do to be better allies and community members. So it's 12:05. So here's what I suggest. Let's all turn off our cameras and go on mute for 5 minutes. And at 12:10, we're going to put you into paired breakout rooms. And in your breakout rooms, take 5 minutes for each person to say, okay, this is what I thought of. This is what I have so far. And together with your partner, you can go over, oh, here's some additional context you could add, or do you potentially have some evidence that could take it in this direction, and work together to kind of flesh out the outline for this post. I mean, obviously this is going to be a very proto piece, but think of your partner as like your potential editor, who is going to ask you, these kinds of questions when you submit. So we'll at 12:11 we'll get into the breakout rooms. We actually toss it to a participant and see if someone wants to kind of talk through some ideas that they've had.
I can go.
Great.
So my name is Holly Matt, and I'm a postdoc. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah, one second. Vince and Nicole, sorry, we had some issues with the breakout room, so we're just going to do it all together as a group. Apologies for the
okay.
for the confusion.
That's great.
Okay,
That's
great.
fine.
Okay, great. Halimat, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Go ahead.
No, that's okay. So I am Alimat Martin, and I'm a postdoc at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh. So it's good to hear that Abigail is in Pittsburgh as well, and got a PhD from Carnegie Mellon. So that's great. So I am my research focuses on Lagos. I'm turning my dissertation into a book, and it's a social history of decolonization in Lagos, Nigeria. And I'm interested in how ordinary people in Lagos are shaping the city's political transition and how they're trying to secure their everyday needs in the moment of this transition from colonial rule to independence. So one of the things that I've always sort of stuck with me during the research, I often come across certain individuals and actors whose lives and experiences and their demands are not often in line with how historians often think about actors like that. So, for example, there is this woman who I initially, when I was doing the research, I assumed that she was not literate in English. And she kind of falls into one of this group of like market women traders who have a very big political organization in Lagos and obviously in most of West Africa. And, historians, tend to think about them as forging solidarity to sort of contest colonial economic policies that threaten their interest. So they sort of came together, women like Bintu, her name is Bintu, come together in my thesis as kind of like an interest group who are sort of showing up in issues around like how the municipal council can work better for them, as well as protesting slum clearance that happened in Lagos in the 1950s. So one of the things that I was thinking about was, obviously it's already been established that we know that, women are not sort of like an amorphous group who often think about their interests as often in line with each other. But what happens if someone who we assume, in this case, Bintu, whose ideas and lives and demand are sort of aligning with the Market Women Association, and when she doesn't really do that, in the sense of the fact that, I found this moment when she's part of this activism against a slum clearance, and then eventually towards the end, as the association was sort of like crumbling, she decided to withdraw and took another position. So she's someone that I sort of find in different moments in the city's history. On one hand, sort of aligning with how historians often think about this like Market Women Association and their activism, and at other times sort of contesting that whole paradigm. So I thought maybe, this person's life might be a way to think about the multiple positions that women often take that in some cases can be contradictory to like the interests of the greater group. And what does that really do for us? And in terms of thinking about women's history and this moment of like Nigeria's transition, I don't think I'm quite clear about, like how to give a contemporary hook yet, but I think I'm still kind of stuck in thinking about it within like the historiographical context and how to elevate the voices of, women like Bintu, who did not write a biography. I'm just like finding bits of our life in different places in my archival research, basically.
I think your hook is that we are at a moment politically where I don't just think in the US, I think kind of globally, where we're reckoning with the heterogeneity of groups that have been discussed monolithically before. And we're also in a political moment that seems tragically wed to the binary of good and evil, yes and no. And the reality is that all of us are complex and contradictory, every single one of us, and that we don't honor that complexity and contradictory nature keeps us trapped in these cycles of polarization. That's your hook.
Yeah, I think that last part was really good. There's the tension between her interests in the market, but then her self-interest when the activism either becomes more contested in a way that's not benefiting her in the same way, because that is actually, when you, particularly if you're an urban resident, these are tensions, contradictions that we all deal with on a daily basis. I do think that Abigail, the last part, really pegged what the central argument of your piece would be. that we are complex actors in these larger forces, and we have to navigate them, and how people navigate them says a lot about them, but also about the situation at hand.
Yeah, I would like to suggest that this blog post could look a lot of different ways. It could be a more traditional, like, here's her biography, here's what it tells us, history present. It also could be a really beautiful personal essay or meditation on this, one of my dissertation advisors, I think this was probably the best advice I ever received as a historian and as a human being. I came to one of my dissertation, my committee members, with a rabbi who had written one thing and written another thing. It was the same person, and these things were not the same. They were contradictory. And she just went, oh, Abigail, people are not internally consistent. And I was just like, and it changed forever how I understand everyone from my husband and family to historical actors and people I deal with. So I think if you have that in you, it could also go in that direction and just be your own conversation with this person in history, and how you see yourself connecting to them and connecting to the world around you, and exploring all of that. I think either could be really beautiful and powerful. And I'm so appreciate you getting us started with Bintu's story. I think it is an awesome seed. Does anyone else have idea? I got really exercised about that and excited. So I don't want to
Nicole, right? Did you raise your hand, Nicole?
Hi, everyone. My name is Nicole Gibson. I am a newly minted PhD. I just finished my PhD at the University of Manchester and am in full transition as an early career scholar. I am the early career representative for historians of the 20th century US in the UK. And so I'm writing abroad, looking back at my country. I'm also French, so I have a very global perspective on my research, and I have lots of connections abroad. I've been living abroad for many, many years now, but now I'm now that I've finished my PhD, I'm interested in developing my research into a book form. However, I've decided not to keep my research in its original site, but to move it from Washington, D.C., which is my original thesis site, and moving it to New York City. And what is my research about? It's basically about homelessness. And what I did in my thesis is I took Arnold Hirsch's theory of the second ghetto, and I theorized that if the second ghetto is public housing, then the third ghetto is homelessness. And I developed that historical framework, and I developed it specifically in Washington, D.C. But what I decided to do that once I finished my PhD is to do as the monks do in Nepal, and erase all of that research in the sand, and move away from my historical framework of the third ghetto and focus on some of the iterations that I found in the third ghetto, and one of them is welfare hotels. And I'd like to develop welfare hotel history, not in Washington, D.C. specifically, but in New York City, but also keep a dialogue between what was going on politically in Washington, D.C. and principally in New York, and develop my book on the rise and fall of welfare hotels in New York City between 1970 and 1990. According to my thesis and my historical framework, welfare hotels are an iteration of the third ghetto, but I want to get away from that historical framework and focus more on gender issues, family homelessness, urban poverty, some of the larger issues, and get away from that historical framework that I developed in my thesis. I have written an extract of what I feel like the blog tone would be. Would you guys like to hear what I wrote about my research in blog form?
Do it.
May I read it? Okay. So, was there a connection between the use of welfare hotels and the broader issues of homeless service provision and welfare reform at the end of the Reagan administration? If there was, I just couldn't see it. However, the gradual unfurling of a succession of reflective early mornings opened up the possibility of correlation. Engaging there with early morning clarity, a fresh mind, and a sizable dose of my best coffee, I began to connect the dots. In the throes of this dynamic, I came to a singular realization. The policies and practices that created and perpetuated the use of welfare hotels for African American single female heads of household on AFDC benefits for motives of profit and power were acts of gendered state violence. Two of the most compelling iterations of this violence were the Hotel Martinique in New York City and the Pitts Motor Hotel in Washington, D.C. The phasing out and eventual closure of both these notorious welfare hotels coincided with the passage of the Family Support Act of 1988, a feckless piece of legislation and an empty gesture towards congressional bipartisanship. Okay, that's the paragraph. So you can see it gives you an idea of my research, and I'm still remaining in dialogue with Washington, D.C., my original research site, but I'm expanding out to New York City, which quite frankly has a much richer archival research there for me. So what I was going for there, I was playing around with the blog tone, trying to be at once personal, but get in the serious business of laying down facts.
So I think you hit that tone really well, and your writing is beautiful. I think it is a big thing you're trying to do. I know you're trying to shift away from that third ghetto framework, but I think for a blog post, actually, even if you go on to kind of like explain why you're dissatisfied with that framework, at least starting there can help the reader understand your arrival at the topic. Or you could dispatch with it entirely, but then I would stay really focused on unpacking this, like exactly what you mean about state-centered violence, like, and really getting into those complexities. I think you can totally do the two hotels, but it might, just focusing on one and going into thick description could probably do the same work.
Yeah, I agree with everything she said. Yeah, just I would also just reiterate what Abigail said. I do actually think your third ghetto is actually like a really interesting premise, but I understand why you're pulling away from it. But I would just say that I do agree with her that I think it is effective, even if you did explain, like she said, why it was not satisfactory for you.
Well, I'm actually waiting to be peer reviewed on this historical framework in that context, and I prefer that it be validated in a peer review context. One thing I've noticed, and I'll be honest with you, white scholars tend to really like the third ghetto concept. Because it goes back, of course, to such a foundational work in urban history, that being the second ghetto. Black scholars do not. Black scholars, well, the feedback that I've been getting from Black scholars is, well, yeah, Hirsch is what, 38 years old now. So what do you have to say that's new? And I do have something to say that's new, but there's a big backlash against Hirsch's work because it's packed with all sorts of problems with Black agency. You know, you've read Hirsch's work, you know, there are problems, it's out of date, etc. But I do still defend the framework. And I don't just take up the baton of Hirsch's work. I call it into question and say, listen, okay, well, let's put up Joe Trotter's ideas of community formation and let's go back to that 1980s debate. And the third ghetto, the way that I've conceptualized it, resolves the debate, taking the best of both ends of the debate and moves forward with a third way, if you will, if I can push the number analogy. But what I wanted to do going forward, developing my book, my research is going to be based on in New York, the rise and fall of welfare hotels. I wanted to develop another concept, which I will not share at the moment, but which will be central to the book. It's going to have its own identity. So yeah, I think one of the things that I will do is come back to the third ghetto in the book, in the epilogue, and explain why I made the decision to break with the third ghetto, or not to break with it, but rather to put it on the back burner and privilege other more interesting ideas such as gendered state violence. So the book's purpose is to show that welfare hotels are an iteration of gendered state violence. But on a blog level, I want to hone in even more and get away from some of the more lofty conceptual frameworks and hone in on the actual hotel, so I can focus more on Black agency and those living inside the hotel, and then expand out and look at the broader issues of welfare reform. That, for me, pulling off the hat trick of bringing homelessness, family homelessness into the broader issue of welfare reform is the real hat trick to be done in the blog post. My idea would be to post this in maybe Black perspectives.
Great. I'm just paying attention to the time, so I don't mean to cut you off, but you actually have given us a perfect segue to the last bit that we just wanted to go over with everyone. I'm just going to share my screen again. Nicole, thank you so much for talking to us about your thought process and your really, really interesting research and the debate internally and with peer reviewers you're having about the framework. So y'all all have now this idea about what you want to write about. So it's time to find a blog. Black Perspectives is a great option. The Metropole, of course, will put in a plug for. This link here in this slide will take you to the OAH's list of blogs on their website. It is not, it is a comprehensive list, but it is not the be all end all. There are other great blogs out there for you to find, but I did want to give you one handy resource. The first thing always to do is check the submission guidelines, just like you would submitting to any journal or publication. So, if they ask for 12-point Times New Roman, send it into 12-point Times New Roman. That's not really usually one of the submission guidelines, being glib, but definitely their citation format is something to look for. Also check whether they prefer to have a pitch, or to have you pitch first, or they want a full draft to review first. We generally will take either. It's nice to see a draft, but we also don't want people to write something that we may not be interested in. So it's, I think, good practice to send a pitch first, even if you already have a draft written. And then you work with editors to revise. So I would say blogs are definitely faster than peer-reviewed journals, but the editorial process can still take a few weeks. So generally when we receive posts at the Metropole, it'll take us something like a week or 2 weeks to get it into our editorial queue and get it back to you. But then generally we have a quick turnaround. We ask for a quick turnaround to get it back to us and get it ready for publication. It is completely within the realm of possibility to go back and forth just once, but it is not uncommon for us to go back and forth 2 or 3 times working on a post. Something I really do want to take a minute to go into a little depth on is providing visuals. It is a huge help to blog editors if you can provide visuals. Please, before you send them in, check that they're either in the public domain, have a Creative Commons license, or if they're from an archive that you've already gotten archival permissions, or they're a photo you took yourself of like a building or the place you're writing about. I'm now realizing author photos seems like headshot, but we do want one of those too. But what I meant is photos taken by the author that they have the copyright over and can give us permission to use.
I would just add to that, like in life, take a lot of photos with your iPhone. I can't tell how many times we've used photos that I just happen to take on vacation. Because if you think something's interesting, it's worth, and then if you took it, it's completely in the domain and it's yours too. So to actually add something from like the personal perspective.
Yeah, for sure.
And I would just say one last thing about, and I'll let Abigail finish up with this final thing. In terms of like why blog, we already talked, but there are other ancillary benefits that we haven't talked. Like one, I can tell you now that I used to teach, and several of my blog posts turns into lectures for classes at the university and community college level, and it made my life a lot easier. And having that stuff written down and the sources and the citations made it easier to pass on to students. Many times I've had a newspaper like Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, New York Times contact me because they read a blog post I wrote maybe years ago and interviewed me. And then when I applied for jobs, I was able to say, hey, I'm an expert because so-and-so has interviewed me on this topic. Now, was I an expert? Probably not. But, as we all know, getting jobs is about selling yourself as much as anything else. And then the other thing I'd say is just that we've had several articles turn into journal articles, reposted on other blogs, picked up by Vice, 538. So there are real ancillary benefits to these that aren't just about writing and publishing, but also about your broader outreach to the media. I saw that Nicole put podcasting 101. I'll have to not be involved in that one since I've never done that, but I think that's a good idea. But podcast too, that's a media outlet that I've been asked to speak on for public radio once or twice because of an article I wrote years ago. So I guess the larger point is that it's also a way of kind of putting your flag in the sand. Putting a flag in the sand would be a terrible idea. Putting your flag down on some subject as well.
Yeah. And that's what we mean by this last point, the long tail, like the numbers, the publication, the readership numbers on the day or week of publication are just the beginning of the story. I'll go in reverse order. Encourage others to submit to a blog if you've had a good experience. That's really helpful to blogs and enables them to keep doing the work and being an outlet for you to submit to. And share. For the love of God, I always promote your work, send it to your department, send it to your friends, send it to your mom, send it to your best friend from childhood and your best friend from adulthood, like everyone, because that's what sustains the ecosystem of history blogging. So I always try to ask, thanks so much for publishing with us. We're so appreciative. One last task. Amplify. So with that, we're 9 minutes over, and I'm just so grateful to everyone for hanging in there when we went a little long.
Thanks for coming, everyone. We appreciate it.
Yes. I can stick around for a minute if people have additional questions. we'll end the formal proceedings here.